Imagine yourself in total darkness, with only the sound of your own breathing echoing off the rock walls. Today, I'm going to tell you two absolutely terrifying stories about caving that went terribly wrong. The first will take you into a deadly trap where the raging ocean turns a peaceful cave into a watery grave. The second, well, prepare to discover what happens when the earth itself decides to crush you alive. Our first story begins on a perfect morning on August 6, 1997, in Hawaii. Thomas Mitchell, a 23-year-old tourist, had just met Jake Williams, a local who knew the island's most secret spots. Jake had offered him something extraordinary: to explore sea caves that virtually no tourist had ever seen. These caves had been carved directly into the volcanic cliffs by thousands of years of sea erosion. The entrance looked like a gaping mouth in the black rock, nearly 5 meters high at its highest point. A narrow ledge of solidified lava formed a natural path inward, but you had to be sure-footed to avoid slipping. Jake, who had explored this cave several times before, led the way. Thomas followed close behind, fascinated by the unique patterns created by the different lava flows on the walls. The dark areas bore witness to the most recent eruptions, while the lighter sections told the ancient geological history of the island. But here was the problem: neither man had really paid attention to the marine weather forecast that morning. If they had, they would have seen the high swell warning issued for the Kona coast. A distant storm was generating waves much larger than normal, and August was known for unpredictable ocean conditions in this region. They ventured deeper into the cave until they reached a point where the floor dropped down to meet a pool of seawater that rippled gently with the waves. Jake suggested they take a break here to take some pictures. The spot seemed perfect. Thomas positioned himself carefully near the edge, about 2 feet above the water's surface. He wanted to capture the mysterious interior of the cave. Neither of them noticed the subtle but terrifying change. The ambient roar of the ocean had just decreased dramatically. This unnatural silence is what experienced sailors recognize as the calm before the storm. The first warning came too late. A strange sucking sound echoed as the water in the pool suddenly receded, dropping several meters below its previous level. Jake had just enough time to shout a warning before a monstrous wave rushed toward them, far more massive than anything they had seen since entering the cave. The wave rushed into the cavity with explosive force, sending a wall of water toward them at terrifying speed. The ledge where they had been standing, previously safe above the water, was instantly submerged under nearly a meter of raging ocean. The force of the impact threw them both to the ground, sweeping them away like straws. Thomas experienced a moment of pure disorientation. He suddenly found himself underwater, tossed around uncontrollably in the grip of the powerful current. His shoulder struck a submerged rock painfully, followed by his head, which hit another stone. Jake, more accustomed to ocean conditions, managed to grab hold of a protruding rock formation as the first wave broke. He saw Thomas's silhouette gesticulating, being carried toward the cave entrance by the powerful receding wave. Letting go of his hold, Jake allowed himself to be carried by the same current, knowing that their best chance of survival was to escape the cave before the next wave arrived. The receding water threw them out of the cave entrance at an alarming speed, carrying them over the sharp volcanic rocks that had served as their entrance. Thomas felt the burn as the rough surface tore his skin, leaving a trail of scrapes on his legs and arms. Even more worrying was the sickening impact when his head struck a protruding rock. The momentary relief of being out of the cave was quickly replaced by a new danger. They were now in the open sea, pulled away from the shore by the powerful receding wave. The next wave in the series was already visible, a swell rolling toward them at a frightening speed. Jake shouted to Thomas that they had to get back to shore before the next wave hit them. Thomas, struggling through the fog of his head injury, instinctively responded to the urgency in Jake's voice. The two men swam desperately toward the nearest shore, fighting the current that was trying to pull them further out to sea. The approaching wave grew larger as it drew nearer, its face rising from a gentle swell into a menacing wall of water. Jake, gauging its approach, made a split-second decision that probably saved both their lives. He ordered Thomas to dive and pass under the wave. His years of surfing had taught him that diving under an unbroken wave was safer than being caught in its breaking face. The two men took a deep breath and dove under the surface just as the wave passed over them. The turbulence still shook them like puppets, but they avoided the worst of its destructive force. When they resurfaced, gasping for air, they found themselves closer to shore. The energy of the wave had actually helped push them closer to land. Exhausted, they managed to reach a point where they could let the foam carry them the final distance to shore. But their ordeal was far from over. They had reached the coast, but not the beach they had started from. Instead, they found themselves at the foot of a sheer cliff that rose about 40 feet above them. The narrow strip of black sand and rocks where they stood was no more than 10 feet wide and would disappear completely at high tide. They were effectively trapped between the vertical cliff and the unpredictable ocean that had just demonstrated its deadly potential. Exposure became their new enemy. Despite Hawaii's tropical climate, being soaked under the persistent trade winds caused their body temperatures to drop dangerously. The sun had passed its zenith and would soon disappear behind the cliff, leaving them in shadow. Thomas, still dazed from his head injury, was beginning to show the first signs of shock: pale skin, confused reactions, and uncontrollable shivering. Their salvation came in the form of another tourist, a woman who was tidying up along the cliff top and happened to spot two figures on the otherwise deserted coast. Recognizing their distress, she immediately called the emergency services. But now let's move on to our second story, which is even more terrifying. This time, it's not the ocean that will be the enemy, but the earth itself. The air was heavy with humidity when 15-year-old Sarah Mitchell joined her campmates for what was supposed to be a simple caving adventure. It was the morning of August 3, 2004, and the destination for the day was Blackstone Ridge Cave in Virginia. Sarah had put on her helmet, adjusted her headlamp, and listened carefully to the instructor's safety instructions. No one could have predicted how dramatically the day would unfold. Blackstone Ridge Cave was well known to local caving enthusiasts. The camp had been bringing teenagers to its most accessible sections for years without any serious incidents. Mark Thompson, the lead instructor for the day's expedition, had traversed these passages dozens of times. As they descended, the summer heat faded with each step, replaced by the natural coolness of the cave. For the first hour, the adventure went exactly as planned. The group squeezed through passages that required them to turn sideways, experiencing the unique sensation of exploring spaces that had never been touched by sunlight. About 150 meters past the entrance, the passage narrowed into a collapsed area. Here, the ceiling had partially caved in at some point in the distant past, creating a maze of rocks and crevices that required careful navigation. Sarah was fourth in line, following closely behind Mark and two other campers. Her headlamp illuminated the path just enough to see a few meters ahead. The landslide area forced them to carefully step from rock to rock. Some stones were firmly anchored, others wobbled dangerously under the weight. When it was Sarah's turn to cross, she placed her foot on what appeared to be a secure rock. Without warning, the rock shifted under her weight. In an instant, her world tilted. Her arms flailed frantically as she tried to regain her balance, but she began to fall. It wasn't a long fall, perhaps a meter, but she landed awkwardly between two large rocks. The impact of her fall triggered a secondary disaster. The unstable rock formation above her, disturbed by her weight and movements, began to give way. Several rocks, ranging in size from fist-size to nearly 10 kilograms, broke away from the cave walls. Sarah barely had time to cover her head with her arms before the rocks came crashing down around her. One of them struck her helmet with enough force to crack the plastic. When the brief landslide stopped, Sarah found herself partially buried. Rocks covered her chest and left arm, while her legs were stretched out and trapped. The weight on her chest made every breath conscious, the pressure squeezing her ribs with each inhalation. But this was only the beginning of her nightmare. Not only was she partially buried under a layer of rocks, but her right leg was trapped between two immovable blocks. She twisted her body, trying to free herself, but found herself stuck in several directions. Her leg was stretched out at an uncomfortable angle, trapped from the middle of her calf to her ankle. The realization of her situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Above her head were millions of tons of earth and stone. Around her, a trap of rock that seemed to tighten with every movement. Her breathing quickened as panic began to rise like floodwater in her chest. The cave that had seemed magical just moments before was now a stone prison that enclosed her on all sides. And the worst was yet to come.